In 1644, the Manchu invaded, and many Chinese reacted as if the world had come to an end. But the outcome of this foreign invasion was very different from the earlier Mongol invasion. The Manchu had already adopted many Chinese customs and institutions before their conquest. And after they gained control of all of China, they showed respect for Chinese tradition. In art, almost all of the Ming traditions continued uninterrupted. By this point, literati painting is now established as the dominant tradition, and it ultimately became the academic style that was practiced at court. It became orthodoxy. And we see that they base their study on, they base their work on the study of past masters. And we've seen that before, that kind of reverence for the masters who've come before you. Let's look at Shitao's landscape from 1700. Shitao is, this is, not necessarily a peaceful time, though I don't want to give that impression. For these early decades of the Qing rule were traumatic and dangerous for those who remained loyal to the Ming. And I think in Shitao's work, he is a descendant of the first Ming emperor, and we see a little bit of this kind of emotional, tumultuous feeling captured in the very kind of shaky, energetic lines of the brushwork here. And he actually, when the Ming Dynasty fell, he actually had to flee Beijing. He goes to kind of escape to a monastery, and his work really brings us to the brink of abstraction. I mean, we have some cliff faces here. We have this kind of tiny house tucked into the cliffside, but it really expresses his feelings, I think, about the kind of insecurity, feeling unsure about the future, and his place in the new regime. So in 1911, the Qing dynasty is overthrown. And this is huge because that means in China, 2,000 years of imperial rule has come to an end. And a republic was established, a revolution that was led by Sun Yat-sen. And we see this Republican, not the kind of political party in the US, but a republic-based government is established in China. And then in 1949, we see another huge paradigm shift in China when a communist government is established. Mao Zedong, is the chairman of the Communist Party, and he is the leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 until 1976. And for Mao, the art under communist China is in service of the state. That is the function of art in society. And the important period here for us is the Cultural Revolution that takes place between 1966 and 1978. The goal of the Cultural Revolution is to purge any remaining traditional or capitalist elements from society. So traditional, that means literati painting. That means all of this kind of tradition of Chinese landscape, as well as those Chinese artists who in the early part of the 20th century had traveled to the West to study avant-garde art. We're going to start with a work that is done in the early days of the Cultural Revolution, and then we're going to turn to some more recent Chinese artists who have begun to critique the Chinese state after the Cultural Revolution, when there is a more relaxed context. Here we see in Liu Chunhua's painting a very young Chairman Mao who stands high over this landscape. Look at that low horizon line. He's looking off into the distance to something we can't see, kind of standing defiantly, his shoulders squared, looking like he is ready to weather any storm. And it's painted, again, as I said, at the dawn of the Cultural Revolution, and it's really being used here in service of the state to portray Chairman Mao as a revolutionary leader committed to championing the common people. There's a lot of portraits of Mao that come out of the Cultural Revolution, and it aims to establish his dominance. There were bitter power struggles within the Communist Party in China, and he takes a very kind of dictatorial radical approach to removing his enemies or anyone who might have ideas in contradiction to him. The model for this type of heroic leader portrait comes from a style that was developed in the Soviet Union, another communist state, that is called socialist realism. And socialist realism was introduced to China in the 50s in order to establish an art style that's suitable for the state's propagandistic purposes. The goal of socialist realism is to present leaders as wise, caring, powerful figures, and to present works that were also naturalistic as well. I mean, think about the radical avant-garde of the 50s and 60s, moving towards complete abstraction. Here we see something that has naturalistic use of color, illusionistic space. This is easy to read, easy for anyone to understand. Let's see, let's go back here. So this is a particular event from Mao's life. And it's a critical moment in the Chinese Communist Party history, because in Anyuan, there were big coal mines. And so Mao is marching towards this site of proletariat work, the coal mines, where he was instrumental in the early days of the Communist Party. So this is an event that took place 40 years before, where he organized a big nonviolent strike of 13,000 miners and rail workers. And this really helped solidify Mao in his early career as a leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Here's a few other examples of this type of socialist realism that becomes the dominant style of the Cultural Revolution. And you might even be familiar with this portrait of Mao here on the right. This is kind of the standard portrait of Mao that gets reproduced infinitely in the 60s and 70s. And so this is the context, the kind of very authoritarian, very kind of tightly controlled art world that the next generation of artists that they grow up in. And so we see people like Xu Bing, later Ai Weiwei, who begin to kind of question the Chinese government's policies. This installation is so fascinating to me because I love thinking about language. I love thinking about this relationship between image and text. And so what we see is a full room installation of Chinese characters. We see them in seas of waves of open books. There's long pieces of paper stretched across the ceiling. There's hand-bound books. And, to somebody in the West, you might just look at that and say, oh, okay, Chinese characters, books. But Xu Bing has actually invented an entirely new character system. So the characters look familiar. They use the same building blocks as Chinese, but they actually don't mean anything. So the meaning here is elusive to both Westerners and to a Chinese audience. This is not all done with ink and brush, but there's some hand-carved block. And in fact, that kind of early movable type that, we associate with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in Renaissance Europe. The system of Chinese type is much older in China. It's a very early form of mass production. And print media, mass-produced print, played a huge role in Xu Bing's early life. He grew up during the Cultural Revolution when the very notion of the creative individual was mistrusted by the government. And anything that was deemed intellectual was suspicious. It was all about the state. It was all about the collective identity. And he was very talented in calligraphy as a child, and he was actually sent to the countryside, put to work by the state to make banners with these kind of propagandistic messages. And so he's trained in the art of propaganda, as every other artist was at that time. But he begins to kind of reconsider that in his later work, like Book from the Sky. And I think the central question here is, we look at this and we think, okay, a book is something to read, but if we can't locate meaning in what we read, where is the meaning? Where is the meaning of this work, of this kind of made up nonsense language? And I think what Xu Bing is trying to tell us is that, during the Cultural Revolution or under any sort of authoritarian state, people are inundated with these very reductive kind of gas-lighting messages through posters and propagandas. And so I think Xu wants us to think about the sources of our information, and he wants to, I think, he also wants us to remember that we need to be very, I'm talking about this now, thinking about our tumultuous political situation in the United States. And I think, boy, is this really resonating with me in a way I have not considered before, because isn't this something that we deal with now? We have to be careful about getting news from trustworthy sources, from people trained in journalism. We need to think about the messages that we receive from political leaders in the government, and we have been, we, I think, are just highly attuned to almost the kind of warning that comes in Xu Bing's work. All right. Okay, I have 2 minutes, and then Screencast-O-Matic is going to kick me off. And so we'll finish up with one more final video here, but I just want to bring this up briefly because this should look a little bit like Leonardo's Last Supper. Recast here, where Mao is occupying every single figure. He is the figure of Christ in the center. He's the figure of all 12 disciples. And here, I love this because I eat a lot of oatmeal. The Quaker oat guy, Mao has been superimposed over him, but he still has this kind of Quakery white cravat and black jacket. Zhang Hongtu is another artist who grew up within the Cultural Revolution, and he goes to the West in the 80s, and he begins to think about this kind of omnipresence of Mao in Cultural Revolution era visual culture, and he wants to kind of play with these images of Mao. In the same way, I think that Andy Warhol also, he takes these images that get repeated and repeated over and over to kind of jolt us into a more heightened awareness so that we become a little bit more critical of what we're seeing. And I think that this kind of confusion of propaganda, religion, ideology, kitsch, the cult of personality, it happens in both China and the West.